Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Behavioral Science and Risk Communication session. This is particularly an interesting and complex topic, and one that has grown in popularity as we work to drive resilient behaviors for individuals and communities. Today, we have three very compelling and tactical presentations for you that I'm excited for you to hear. But before we jump into those, let me first introduce myself. My name is Adam Lucas, and I'm an Associate Director at Guidehouse, where I lead teams delivering operational effectiveness and behavioral science-based change management solutions for our public sector clients. If you aren't familiar with Guidehouse, we are a global consulting firm and have a long history supporting resilience work nationally through our longstanding partnership with FEMA and at the state and local level, and bring behavioral science experience to help our clients drive behavior change through risk communications. So, particularly interesting topic for me as well. Now let's jump into our first presentation with Jordanna Rubin from AECOM. This one's titled Behavior-Based Change: What Can Flood Mitigation Leaders Learn from the Energy Industry? Before we do that, I'd also like to introduce Jordanna. Jordanna Rubin brings over 20 years of experience focused on the design and implementation of resilient and equitable disaster recovery programs. At the heart of her work is a passion for client success and a focus on building trusted partnerships. Jordanna currently serves as the Vice President of Resilience and Disaster Recovery for AECOM. Jordanna has led the successful implementation of equitable and innovative programs throughout the country. Many of those programs have required creative thinking, faced unbalanced markets, and helped facilitate public policy and managed chaos. Jordanna has helped with the relocation of an indigenous community out of a high-risk zone in southern Louisiana, developed a COVID-19 food security program to reach vulnerable populations, and produced water reuse and solar feasibility studies, and managed resilience and recovery teams in California, New York, Florida, and Texas. During her career, Jordanna has served as the Director of Resilience and Sustainability for APTM, Environmental Manager for the City of Miami Beach, Assistant Director for the Columbia University Energy Policy Center, and as an analyst for NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. She serves as the co-chair of the Florida Green Building Coalition local government committee, and has also volunteered as a mentor for young professionals for the San Diego American Planners Association and Barnard College. Welcome, Jordanna. We're glad to have you here, and let's jump into her presentation.
Good day. My name is Jordanna Rubin, and I am Vice President of Resilience and Disaster Recovery for AECOM. And today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about behavior-based change and what that means for flood risk mitigation, specifically learning lessons from the energy industry. Today we'll run through the definition of behavior-based energy efficiency, understand how the energy industry has adopted behavior-based energy efficiency to meet their energy reduction goals. We'll go through some important concepts of behavior modification, and then we'll talk about flood risk opportunities. So this is not my daughter, but I do have two wonderful daughters. But, occasionally I will walk into their room and try to understand, why are the clothes all over the floor? Why are all the lights on? There's an empty hamper sitting in the corner. What is going on? And how do I change that behavior specifically? And what motivates them? So this is just trying to give you an introduction of what my life is, and understand this is a personal struggle, but we all kind of go through this. So this kind of sets the frame for how do we understand motivations and habits and how that interrelates to behavior change. So as we start thinking about trying to get communities to change, these are the elements we're trying to work through. So understanding behavior-based energy efficiency. Let's start with the energy efficiency world. And we have to understand that behavior-based programs focus on energy savings that result from changes in a behavior and not just technological adaptation. So for example, we have to recognize that people's motivations can be swayed by social, philosophical, political, or moral factors. And so behavior-based energy efficiency has focused beyond just traditional energy utility programs that have just in the past focused on technology. So it's not just about adopting energy efficient technology, it's about understanding people's motives and habits, and how we can change that to help them reduce their energy efficiency and meet energy efficiency. And so behavior-based energy efficiency has grown in prominence throughout the country. A lot of utilities are adopting this approach, understanding people's habits and motivations. It has been, widely adopted in waste management, healthcare, and transportation industries. If you think about waste management, the blue bins for recycling, that color change is what, prompts people. It helps them understand it's the cue in their environment to help them understand that's where I go to recycle. Healthcare, a lot of the smoking, anti-smoking ads and campaigns, transportation, getting people to ride their bikes, having bike lanes that prompt with a green coloring so that drivers know where bicyclists go, bicyclists know where do they need to go. So those are prompts in the environment. So to start, I want to give a sense of where the energy industry has come over the last several years. It has started in conservation, moved into energy management, then into energy efficiency, and now we see this behavior-based modification. And so I want to just run you through a brief history of what has happened over the years to get a sense how we came to behavior-based energy efficiency. So starting with in 1973, we had the oil embargo and the energy crisis. Energy prices rose dramatically. There were shortages of petroleum, threats of insufficient heating and oil. And so as a result, you had the concept of just save it, just use less. So that was the concept of conservation that came out of the energy crisis. And then in 1977, we had the Department of Energy was established. And what was interesting is that one of the very first programs that was developed was the Low-Income Weatherization Assistance Program. And that was specifically focused on low-income communities and what they call the energy burden. And what this meant is that low-income communities typically face 3 times as much spending on energy utilities than any other households. So the WAP program, the Weatherization Assistance Program, was specifically focused on weatherization and weather stripping and making the home more energy efficient to reduce that cost. So that's our first kind of few years in energy conservation. Then we move into energy management. And this is where energy management has become like a discipline. It becomes an industry of its own in consulting. And so you'll see the Association of Energy Engineers is formed. There's a certification that is developed in the 80s, a certified energy manager, just to address the growing needs of individuals and organizations that want to meet energy efficiency goals as an industry. And so there's more monitoring, there's more targeting, there's software that's designed to meet the needs of technology and building environments and energy systems. So we saw the development of this consultancy in the market. And so in addition to that, we even see third-party financing or energy service contracting, where the consultants will come in and actually get paid by energy savings. So you have this world of energy management as a discipline. Then we move into the world of climate reduction targets. And this is where the energy efficiency world kind of builds up. You have global growth in energy policies to meet emissions reductions. And so there was the recognition that the role of energy efficiency could play in meeting climate reduction goals and the scale of that economic opportunity. And here you'll find there were a lot of financial incentives set out by utilities and government agencies to help motivate people to meet energy efficiency reduction targets. And so you'll see energy efficient products. There were Energy Star saving programs, utility rebates, tax credits, and other savings programs that were specifically targeting financial incentives. And so then where this behavior-based energy efficiency comes in is a switch from energy efficiency, which specifically relied on financial incentives and motivating people because of those financial incentives, and it flips to behavior-based energy efficiency, where it relies on the motivations that influence people's energy consumption. So you have this transition where they're understanding financial incentives are just not enough. So you've moved from incentives and rebates and pricing to more of programs that focus on the motivations and habits of people and their consumption. So you have information programs, social interactions, and education. Information is specifically looking at home energy reports, getting real-time data of how you're doing. Doing the energy audit was just not enough, but actually providing feedback on a real-time basis. Social interactions, here you have competitions and games, community-based programs where you're competing against your peers in a community, or you're coming together to set a common goal, and that was motivating people to move forward. Education, it was not just about here's some information in a brochure. It's really training people to understand how they can take action and make changes. And so this leads me to an interesting study done by ComEd, where they came about and said, even if energy efficient residential lighting is in place, there's still approximately 11% of waste coming from the household. So we're understanding that occupant behavior has a role in understanding, once you put in place technology, it's not just about having that technology. It's about the occupant behavior, because clearly there's still waste. So we're trying to understand what is happening here. And here's another study out of UCLA that surveyed 188 households in a residential community. And so first they had two groups. One had a message that was given to them that said, here's the amount of money you saved. And the second one was, here's how much pollution you have avoided. And what was interesting is the group that had the message about money increased their usage by about 3.8%. And the group that had the public health message decreased their energy consumption over time. And so we're trying to understand what happened here, because it's kind of a little counterintuitive, or you're not really sure why one message would have an influence over the other. So is it that the money-saving message just wasn't enough to motivate someone? Maybe they didn't save enough money, so it wasn't of value to them. Was it the rebound effect? So, for example, they installed LED lighting, and then they felt, I can keep my lights on longer because it's more energy efficient, and I'm not wasting as much energy. So maybe there's that disconnect there. Or perhaps when you were told about, financial reasons, that was framing your environmental motivations as a financial transaction, and that may have backfired based on their motivation of that community. So the point here is that we really, for these two case studies, we really need to understand what are the motivations and what are the habits of the community and the consumer. And so that brings us to behavior change. And there are two aspects of just trying to understand, why is behavior change so hard? Why can't I get my kids to pick up their clothes, or why can't I get them to turn the lights off? So there are two important things here we need to understand, right? There is motivation and there are habits. When we think about motivation and why that's important and why that matters, there are four pieces to this. There are beliefs, there are assumptions that we make about the world, there are values, and these stem from our beliefs, the things we deem most important, like honesty or loyalty, conservation, perseverance, education. And then there's attitudes. This is the way we think or feel, and it's typically reflected in our behavior, right? Then we have social norms. This is how we're influenced by our peers. And these are the unwritten rules that are considered acceptable as we go through. So these are important for understanding and designing our behavior program based on these motivations. In addition to motivations, we have to understand habits. And there are three features of that habit. There's repetition, there's automatic behavior, and there's your clue in the environment. And if you think in terms of repetition or automatic behavior, how often do you go in the morning and just go get your cup of coffee without being awake or understanding that you're even walking into the kitchen to get that cup of coffee? And it's just automatic. When, for example, I walk into a movie theater and I have to have popcorn, that's an automatic behavior because I associate that popcorn with, my behavior of sitting in a movie theater. Or a cue in the environment, just something that, when I see something or I smell something, that cues me into I need to have, a certain action or activity from that. And so thinking in terms of behavior-based programs, this is a great kind of breakdown of some of the strategies and approaches you think in terms of strategies. So in the energy efficiency world, they typically break out strategies before an event and after an event. And so, for example, before an event, you typically can do outreach and education, and it provides, consumers information about their own use. And then on the flip side, after the activity has happened, so after an event occurs, essentially, after they have used the energy, they get feedback, and they can either get indirect feedback or direct feedback. The indirect feedback is after some time potentially has passed. Direct feedback is typically in real time or close to real time. So energy efficiency programs sometimes have, real-time reports on your energy consumption and energy use, potentially through an app or other report. On the approaches, there are three ways to go about approaching implementing these strategies. So, for example, you have the focus on the household. That's the individual level. So you're specifically looking at that person's home energy use. Peer or comparative focus, that's comparing you against your peers. How do you rate against other households that have similar characteristics? And then you have a third approach of community focus. How are you engaging on a community basis to come together, potentially creating a sense of a common goal or common target? And so, in summary, for behavior-based energy efficiency, we understand that these behavior change programs in combination can reduce energy consumption. And so these programs are mainly behavioral strategies that help us reduce energy consumption. As far as focusing on the opportunities that we're finding, we want to focus not only on immediate results, but also continued savings over the long term. So in thinking of other programs, you want to look at the long term and the short term as well. And so you want to provide intrinsic motivation. You want to make the person happy for doing what they're doing, because that's the satisfaction of that behavior. You want to change habits. You need to disrupt the old habits and allow for new ones to be adopted. So one out with the old, in with the new, so to speak. And so you have to change how people think about a behavior. Is that new behavior more desirable? Because that's going to motivate you and to change your habit as well. The change in perception of future costs, making that new behavior easier and less costly than changing back. So that's all about pushing someone forward to make that change. And then finally, effective evaluation of those interventions. It's important to be able to evaluate over time, are these changes and strategies working over the long term? And so now you ask me, okay, what are the opportunities for flood risk management? So how do we take these lessons learned from the energy industry and all of the other industries that have already been implementing this, and how do we adopt it for flood risk mitigation specifically? And so we have this concept, within flood risk mitigation of the behavioral turn. And so we understand that structural measures are not enough to offer comprehensive protection. And so we have to understand what is the role of the individual and how are residents expected to take measures to help with flood mitigation. So if you want to move forward on that concept and you take the assumption that individuals can have influence, there are three assumptions that we need to all agree on. The first is that the motivations of the citizens can be understood. And here you need to rely on psychologists to understand what are those motivations of a particular community or an individual. Second, we need to understand if the private adaptation measures and actions are effective in reducing flood risk management, right? Or into flood risk. So can we understand through engineers and economists, is the individual going to have an effect on flood risk mitigation? And finally, sociologists. Individuals have the capabilities specifically to implement such measures. So are individuals even capable of doing this type of work? So these are the three assumptions as we move forward into flood risk mitigation and behavioral change. We need to all agree that these are hold true, right? And so as we take those assumptions and design a framework for flood risk mitigation and behavior-based flood risk mitigation, we have a framework that we can develop to adopt these procedures and programs and strategies. So first is identifying a specific behavior change. What are you trying to change? What specifically are you trying to make a community take action on? And so the more specific you can be, the more likely you will succeed. And the better you're able to measure is also most valuable. Second, identification of the barriers and benefits. These need to be very specific to a targeted population, and you need to do research in order to understand your audience because it's very specific based on the geography or community that you're dealing with. Then selecting behavior change strategies, understand what is the goal you're trying to accomplish, and then making sure the strategies and options fit to meet those needs. And then finally, implement the program and evaluate the program. And so going into each one of these individually, identifying a specific behavior. So it's important to pick the behavior that has the highest impact on mitigation with the least amount of effort, right? So you're trying to understand frequency, intensity, duration. These are the behaviors you're looking for to understand what makes, what change you're trying to accomplish. And so as you're identifying strategies for implementation, you need to think in terms of you're going from frequent to extremely infrequent. What are the behaviors that are done on a more frequent basis, like changing a light bulb as an example, to more occasional or infrequent when you're weatherizing and putting new weather stripping or fixing things in the attic so you're containing energy within the home, or extremely infrequent things like you move because you're closer to where you work, so you don't drive your car as much, and so you're reducing emissions. So there's the low impact to the high impact, easy to difficult. So there's that balance that you need to find as you're picking behaviors to make change between those that have less of an impact potentially to those that are extremely difficult to implement but have much more extreme impact. And so then we go into understanding the barriers and benefits. This is so important because you need really good research to understand what those barriers are to a specific community. And so learning about what is existing in that community between surveys or focus groups, you have to understand and observe behavior in real life. And so as an example, from a survey from Fort Collins, they were trying to identify barriers for consumers to implement energy efficiency retrofits. And they didn't understand beyond finance or saving money, what were the barriers? So when they did conduct the surveys and the outreach to the communities, they actually realized the barriers were not financial to implement the program. The barriers were more, the program was too complex, they lacked time to meet with the contractors, and they didn't have trust in the proposals that were coming back from the contractors to implement their measures. So it was interesting to find out, based on the research that they conducted and surveyed into the community, that this was the issue that was coming out of it. And so as you're selecting strategies, another piece of this framework, you need to understand the stages of change. And so people go through a process of change as they're changing their own behaviors and their stages that come out of this. There's pre-contemplation. They don't even know about this potential change for behavior. Contemplation, where they've heard about it and they're starting to think about it. Preparation, they're kind of moving in the direction of understanding and how it's going to affect them. Taking action is when they actually adopt that behavior and move forward. And then maintenance of it. So, over time, how do they continue this particular behavior? So, again, there's that balance of benefits and barriers of when you start selecting strategies, you need to understand, again, the benefits low to high, barriers low to high. Again, social modeling and social norms when you're in that low benefit, low barrier piece, to all the way to high benefits and high barriers, where you have to make it easy and you have to find ways where they will commit to a particular program. And so as you're considering motivations and habits, and you're customizing your intervention, specifically, let's say for the flood risk mitigation, again, it comes back to intrinsic motivations and changing those habits, understanding that there's repetition, there's setting up contextual cues. How do you remind folks within their environment to make these changes? Timing is also really important. There's the habit discontinuity theory that really gives a sense of designing programs when a significant change has happened. So, for example, giving someone a bus pass right after they have moved, if they're closer to a bus line, to incentivize them to use the bus and public transportation rather than drive their own car. Similar to flood risk mitigation, you have after an emergency or a hurricane or a flood has recently happened, that's the time to really jump in to try to change motivations and habits and implement behavior-based strategies to make change. Thinking about the goal, again, it's not just about the short term, but it's long-term change. And finally, best practices, understanding the context and targeting specific behavior that you're trying to achieve, and then combining the right strategies that meet this. And then finally, the last step in our framework, implementing and evaluate. So it really comes down to the research and design and program implementation, the key factors, not just having the different groups to give different messaging to, but also understanding the control groups so that you have a complete sense of, this was the difference in the change really relates to just this one specific targeted behavior that was the difference between group A and group B versus your control group. And then again, picking the right outcomes to measure success. You want to be measuring the items that are closely related to the behavior you're trying to change. And so finally, just kind of summarizing behavior change and key takeaways. Again, it's important to understand motivations and habits. That's how you're going to achieve your behavior change and what's most relevant to risk flood mitigation. Again, you're going on the assumption that the individuals can play a role. I greatly believe that individuals can play a role in flood mitigation. And then be targeted and specific, prepare, do your surveys and understand the community that you're reaching out to, and then test it. See if this is working for a smaller group, and then move forward on a larger community scale. And then again, continuous evaluation to achieve the best results that you're trying to get. And that is kind of a summary for me. I hope you enjoyed my conversation about behavior-based energy efficiency and some of the lessons learned that we can learn from the energy industry and how we can apply it to flood risk mitigation. Have a great day, and I look forward to the rest of your questions.
Hi, welcome back, everybody. I am joined with Jordanna. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really insightful and really provided a number of tactical ways for us to be thinking about behavior change as it relates to energy efficiency. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Wanted to take a few minutes to acknowledge a question or two that had come in the chat along with some observations. One question we received was, do you find that the same factors influence water efficiency behavior as does energy efficient behavior?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So, water and energy efficiency have gone hand in hand for quite some time. So I think it's extremely relevant to connect the two. Motivations and understanding habits are essential to both water and energy efficiency because they're so clearly tied together. Great question.
Nice. And then there was an observation I wanted to mention because it was pretty spot on. So Brian mentioned one significant difference between energy use and flood risk is that the latter is life-threatening while the former, being energy use, should be more motivating. Because the hazard isn't immediate, most people don't want to acknowledge the risk. The reward is delayed and it may be more difficult to drive change. He mentioned, however, this is a great concept to pursue in floodplain management and risk mitigation. So this idea of energy use versus flood risk and behavior change and the struggle to get people to take action across both of those.
Sure, and so it's a great observation. And so what I would say is that, some of the motivations that are essential that you can actually take action on, one of them in particular has to do with safety. So if you can implement strategies and approach that specifically target the motivations behind feeling safe in a community, you will be successful. And so you can take those behavior changes and strategies to address feeling safe in a community, because that's one of the top motivators for a person, as you're thinking of these strategies.
Nice. And then as we wrap up, I have one more question for you. What is the most interesting behavior change tactic that you've seen in your work in this space?
So there's actually some interesting work that has come out of some of the projects I have run on residential resilience audits. And that's specifically working with homeowners to understand what can they do to reduce their risk. And so one in particular, one project was interesting. It was also in Boulder, and it was specifically looking at how to implement backflow preventers. And this was a result of the floods that were a couple of years back now. But trying to build the trust with the contractors, trying to motivate them through financial incentives, just trying to get them to be involved in the process, was not easy. So you have to understand what was motivating them. And again, that safety piece, that empowerment, another important motivator for people, that is what spoke to the community, to be safe and to be empowered so that they can make the choice to make the change and make their community more safe. Same as another residential program I worked on in Louisiana. That community came together and they wanted a common goal. And so again, you were empowering them to implement green infrastructure, and collectively, each home created this large flood mitigation project. So, it's interesting to really understand when you understand the top motivators and make the changes in habits, you have very effective flood mitigation programs.
It's true. That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that, Jordanna. Really appreciate your presentation. Really appreciate your response to the questions. Folks, if you have any other questions, observations you want to send in the chat, Jordanna can follow up with you after today's session. Thanks, Jordanna.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right, let's shift gears. Today, Glenn is a program management and technical project delivery specialist at Booz Hamilton with over 15 years of experience in hazard mitigation. Glenn has supported FEMA's MAP modernization program, risk map program, National Integration Center, and National Exercise Program. Glenn also has experience in personal finance and is well-versed in insurance products. He has a Master Business Administration degree from Drexel University and an undergraduate degree in Computers and Information Systems from King's College. And he's joined today by Steve, who's a partner at Clarity Financial Planning Group. Steve brings 8 years of experience supporting community resilience work and currently leads a financial practice for over the past 6 years. Glenn and Steve will share a bit more about their backgrounds as we get into their presentation. So let's go ahead and jump in.
Good afternoon, everybody, or at least we think it's afternoon for the session that this is getting recorded for. Glenn Locke and I are here today to talk about topics related to the barriers that people face when achieving resilience at individual and community levels, and really focusing in on two unrelated but related fields in hazard mitigation and financial planning. So we're going to go through some thoughts that we put together on what we describe as the continuum of moving to action, getting a community or an individual to take action to reduce risk, and some important components of that decision-making process, and using two examples from the financial planning realm and community hazard mitigation. And with some time towards the end after the recorded session, we'll be able to touch on a few questions. Just some brief background. Glenn has spent about 15 years in community resilience and hazard mitigation planning. Prior to that, he spent 2 years in a field similar to the field that I'm in today. I've been operating, running a financial planning practice for about 6 years now, but prior to that, spent about 8 years in the community resilience and hazard mitigation planning world, especially as it relates to community hazards in coastal communities, coastal environments. So two very different fields, but we would emphasize that both career paths have a responsibility to educate individuals and communities about their risks. And using some examples today, we have some perspectives on what it takes to drive communities or individuals to change behaviors and reduce those risks. I'll turn it over to Glenn here to go into some concepts to start us off.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone for joining our virtual session today. We're really excited to talk to you about some of these concepts that Steve and I have been talking about for a little while, right? And you see this question I have flashed here on the screen. If you're at risk of something bad happening and you have the ability to do something about it, you should do something about it, right? And that's a question that that I kind of wrestled with throughout the early part of my career when I was doing some personal finance and some question and it has come up again that now that I'm more involved in community resilience. There's some concepts here that Steve and I, really started to think through when answering this question, because, for me, frankly, I had some frustration early in my career that, when I was doing some personal financial planning, I would present to some clients what I thought were some really compelling solutions to help them do something about their risk. And frankly, I would get frustrated that they wouldn't do something about it. And to some degree, it led me away from that field. In talking through it with Steve and time adds perspective, right? We're thinking through some of these concepts. We had some observations, right? So I've summarized them here on the screen here. Number one is, most people do not take actions to reduce their risk simply because they have the ability to do so. I think that was number one for me, was to let go of that and to be able to kind of open my mind a little more to how some of this stuff might work, right? The human decision-making is very complex. So there's no really one-size-fits-all approach to get to, the right outcomes. And there are several obstacles that an individual must overcome before they are willing to act. And people will arrive at different conclusions based on a number of things, but we've still distilled them down to three for today's conversations: risk tolerance, level of trust, and predisposition for change. In today's conversation, we're going to talk to you about, a process or a continuum that results in risk-reducing behaviors, some common barriers that must be overcome along the way, and some practical actions within this context that can help move individuals or communities through this continuum. So again, this continuum of moving to action is really based on the summary of observations that Steve and I have had, both in the financial planning, financial advising space, and also in, community resilience, right? There's really some common themes here that, ideally we're trying to drive that action here on the right of the continuum, right? An action to reduce risk, whether that be, buying a life insurance policy, flood insurance, pursuing some sort of infrastructure project in a community. But in order to get there, we've really distilled things down to these four precursor phases, each of which are influenced by, those three factors I mentioned earlier, right? Risk tolerance, level of trust, and predisposition for change. First and foremost, there has to be some open-mindedness, right? A willingness to explore that a risk exists, and tangibility, awareness that there is a risk. As you move along the continuum, there needs to be some level of trust, right? Even if as an individual, you acknowledge you have a risk and you have a desire to do something about it, you need to have some level of trust in the individual organization that's advising you on what to do, right? So this could be a financial advisor, could be, government agency, a program, And there needs to be accessibility, right? There needs to be, the action to reduce that risk needs to be achievable, right? The individual needs to have the capacity or capability to take that action. As an advisor, right, it's about putting that right solution out there that is, going to get a community or an individual to take action. And it's important, that we really need to check all the boxes on here before anyone will take an action, right? So this is, one of the things Steve and I have been talking through, that if you don't have all four, you're probably going to get stuck somewhere, right? And that when you're approaching a community or an individual, you have to recognize where they're at along this continuum, because individuals can exit this continuum at any phase, right? Like, again, if you have a risk, but you don't have trust in the person advising you on that risk, you're not going to make it all the way to the right on this continuum. And the only way, for us as, advisors and professionals to help people take action is to identify and remove blockers along the way. This is not easy, and many times requires some creativity, right? It may not be obvious where an individual or community is stuck in this continuum. And there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. And also it may take time, right? That, we'll walk through several examples this morning, several examples today of, where some folks get stuck. And it may not be a quick fix, right? If someone doesn't recognize they have a risk, we could talk to them about solutions all day. If they don't believe they have a risk, we're spending our time in the wrong place, right? And conversely, if someone doesn't have a risk, perhaps we should be taking a different approach. So I'll turn it over to Steve to hit our next couple of examples here.
Yeah, so I'm going to touch on two examples here as it relates to financial planning. And the first is getting at the third component there that Glenn was describing on the continuum, trust. And then the second example, we'll focus in on predisposition to change, which is really about open-mindedness. So this picture here is a picture of my niece and I about 4 or 5 years ago. Her name's Mackenzie, and she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 8 years old. So 9 years old, excuse me. So, that's something that I think a lot of people don't know a whole lot about. It's different than type 2 diabetes. But the story I want to share here briefly relates to a decision that my sister had made about 2 years prior to that. Type 1 diabetes, especially juvenile, under the age of 18, is a real issue to get underwritten for life insurance. And if you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes under the age of 18, most reputable life insurance companies will not offer life insurance. Not usually an issue for a young child that doesn't have a significant insurance need, but can be a big issue down the road in their life when they have a family of their own and there's risks that they need to take care of. And so the only way to really prevent an issue there, and this applies to, this is one example of many different health issues that can come up, is to be proactive rather than reactive. And fortunately, my sister, about 2 years prior to Mackenzie's diagnosis, had set up a life insurance policy with an additional purchase benefit on it that will allow her to get more coverage down the road at the same class that she was approved at a young age prior to her diagnosis. The point I want to make here is that, without the relationship that existed between my sister and I, a trusting relationship, I can't imagine she ever would have been comfortable, taking a recommendation from me to set up life insurance for her daughter, never knowing that, 2 years later, the benefit of having an additional purchase benefit on a policy like that was going to be a game changer for, planning with her future grandchildren that are still, years away. And so without trust, and that just being one example, Glenn and I would say that the continuum really comes to a halt. We can provide the best data. We can have people that are open-minded to exploring their risks, but without trust, they're never going to move and take action to mitigate their risks. The second example I want to share here relates to predisposition. And in the financial planning world, I think there's really a lot of examples we could get into here. The one that comes to mind first for me is really out of my experience in having conversations with retired clients that are later into retirement, 75, 80, 85 years old, versus conversations with a 20 or a 25-year-old that's in the early stages of their career, and would say that it's much more difficult to shift perspectives on risk, or certainly to modify financial behaviors for, say, somebody that's 80 years old versus 20 years old. And I think so much of that is just simply due to their experiences. And you can get into the I remember when conversations, and I listed a whole handful of examples here, going back to 1929 and the Great Depression, World War II, the Kennedy assassination, the 1987 stock market crash, the Iraqi war, the dot-com bubble. We had 9/11 shortly after that. Many of you were sure in your working years during the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. And then most recently last year, we have the pandemic. And all of these events influence the way that people think about their finances. They went through and experienced things in different ways, often very scary outcomes, unfortunately. And fear increases with age. I find fear of the markets, fear of what's going to come down the road. And that fear can really create an obstruction to open-mindedness and getting people to sit down and really think about their risks, get second opinions on how well planned they are to manage those risks. And Glenn will share you two examples here, not from the financial planning arena, but from the hazard mitigation and community resilience world.
All right, thanks, Steve. So I'm going to cover a couple examples here of some communities that we've observed some creative approaches on moving through this continuum. I'm going to change the names here to protect the innocent, just kind of an illustrative example here. But this first one is a small rural community with two significant flooding sources that are protected by levees, and they experienced a major flooding event that particularly hit their downtown area, kind of hard, right? And their downtown area is, a key economic driver for that community. So, looking at this community kind of through this continuum here, they were certainly open-minded to explore their risks. The tangibility was there. They had just had some flooding, started to have some challenges with trust, because they had a trust that perhaps FEMA was giving them some good advice. They were discouraged by the levee failures, right? The levee didn't protect the community in the way that they thought it would, right? And this seems to be common in a lot of communities with levees, right? They seem to be predisposed to not want to change, right? They see these physical structures there, and they believe that they are protected, and they believe that the government is doing the right thing for them, and somewhat feel let down if the levees don't operate the way that they think they should, that sort of thing. So the township manager of this small community, he was very open-minded, and really, the community was motivated to be more resilient. But it was a question of how to do it, right? They had been talking to some FEMA folks that were really encouraging, acquisitions, right? Buying out the properties that are at risk, which is obviously a very effective approach to eliminating risk. But this simply was not a palatable option for this community, right? That you know, the properties at risk, that was their key tax base, their key economic driver, and you know, going down that road, they were going to get stopped at accessibility right there, right? So you know, but there was some trust there, right? You know, and being able to have conversations with this community on what an alternative path forward might look like was helpful, right? In some cases, they were able to do, or at least explore some elevations. They were able to explore and ultimately ended up doing some infrastructure improvements, particularly with the levees. I believe they looked at doing some things to their drainage systems, things that, you know, you couldn't even have this conversation if, you know, if they didn't acknowledge the risk and didn't have some trust, right? So the path forward there was really based on understanding, you know, where they were at. I have another example here of another community where, in this case, I'm getting a little more granular, right? So I'm getting down to the neighborhood level, which sometimes, you know, particularly in larger urban communities, you have some individual neighborhoods that tend to get overlooked, right? That it's really hard to drive the right actions to reduce the risk for those neighborhoods. And in this particular neighborhood, it was a neighborhood of mostly renters, mostly Spanish-speaking population, lower income than adjacent neighborhoods, and was experiencing some urban flooding, right? So the community itself, right, that neighborhood in particular, did have some open-mindedness to exploring and acknowledging their risks. They weren't necessarily, you know, anxious to discuss their risks. But the tangibility was there, right? They were seeing this urban flooding, but kind of throughout this continuum, right, there was a challenge of trust, right? Of trusting the government. You know, there's some barriers there, particularly, you know, even just language, like, right? The members of this community were predominantly Spanish speaking, right? So the key barrier to overcome in this particular neighborhood was that of trust. And, you know, our team, you know, really wanted to understand what was going on in this neighborhood and observe that there was a group of mothers that they were all going to the same gym, and it was actually these mothers that were organizing community activities, right? So the members of this community trusted this group of mothers, you know, that were really, you know, highly trusted in the community. The other factor at play here was accessibility. Because this community was mostly renters, you know, a traditional flood insurance policy wasn't necessarily appealing, right? The more appropriate solution for this target audience was the contents-only policies, right? So the path forward to, you know, overcoming trust and accessibility was having, you know, basically the right solution or the right action available, and having the right messenger to deliver that message, right? To have the credibility, to have that trust. You know, so again, it's by understanding where this neighborhood was at in the continuum, it allowed for some creativity to think through some approaches that help move to the, you know, to the right side of the community, of the continuum. So I'll pause there. I'll turn it over to Steve to give us some concluding remarks. I'll hit the key takeaways, and then we'll be ready for some hopefully some good questions and discussion.
Yeah, so, you know, these examples are all Glenn and I really had time here for in the presentation, and we're looking forward to continuing to build around this concept. Certainly, if folks out there have examples or thoughts of their own, we'd love to hear from you. We'll have our contact information here at the end. But I think there might be some thoughts out there about, you know, these different fields, and it goes beyond Glenn and I having overlapping backgrounds. He and I would say that, both of these topics are very critical, building resilient communities and making sure that families and businesses are financially secure, both in the short term and the long term. They're really critical to sustainable societies. So not only is there a connection there, but there's also some real similarities in the challenges that professionals in both fields would face in getting people to take action. So without inspiring action, our work at the end of the day is not very impactful. I mean, we can educate people and quantify risk, but if that's not leading to action, then in both arenas, we're not really getting to the finish line of what we set out to accomplish. And so continuous assessment of this continuum, we would say, improves the probability of action. If we're scoring each of these factors, and only doing well at 2 of the 4, well, we're really not likely going to succeed. And then that can really lead into some applications on decisions for where we allocate time, money, resources, manpower, and then also really pay attention to what needs the most attention. If we've got accessibility and open-mindedness, and also able to do a good job of quantifying that risk, but there's no trust, then we need to bring the right stakeholders to the table to focus on that and get improvement there.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, and I'll just kind of recap the key takeaways again, right? And it's, again, this is a continuum that we built just based on our observations. So we welcome feedback on it. But in terms of getting to outcomes, understanding where people are at in that continuum is helpful. Spending time in the wrong part of the continuum will likely be wasteful and frustrating. And identifying and resolving barriers will require some creativity, right? Getting to the right outcome is going to take some time in some cases. But we would both encourage you for the reasons that Steve mentioned, right? This, the work that we both do in helping individuals and communities reduce their risk is worthwhile. I can assure you that it is. And don't be discouraged, right? Everyone is different. We're all learning on how to move the needle on these things. And hopefully you'll find some of the concepts that we've walked through today helpful. And we'll wrap up here. Feel free to reach out to either Steve or myself. We'll pause here and hopefully we get some good questions and welcome the dialogue. Thanks again for joining us today.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that presentation. I am joined by Glenn and Steve. Thanks for joining us for question and answer. Wanted to start by, we received one question so far in the chat. And it states, how do you build trust in a time when science has become so politicized? It's particularly difficult when the risk is predicted by scientists but hasn't yet occurred, such as with landslide, avalanche issues, in addition to floods.
And I can take the first crack at this based on some observations in the floodplain management space. And my answer isn't going to be very precise, right? Similar to what I covered in the presentation, is that it requires some creativity. It's not new in the floodplain management space that people can be skeptical that they have a risk, and they could also be skeptical of solutions that are put forth, right? So building trust, in my opinion, is about tying all those things together, right? Recognizing, where that community may be at on the continuum, recognizing who the right messengers may be that may be trusted by the community, and then having the right solutions out there that are actually going to resonate and are going to really feel achievable. I'm sure we can all relate to communities out there wrestling with things such as climate change and the like, and each community and each neighborhood within that community is going to view those topics differently. But I think, if we truly want to move the needle and get to the right side of that continuum, it's really having that creativity and understanding where they're at on the continuum, and really trying to approach it in a way that you can get to the desired outcome on the right side. Steve,
Okay.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
Just say the word people. I think it all comes down to people. We can have robo advisors and we can have great floodplain management modeling and tools, but without people, there's no trust usually. Stakeholders.
Yeah, great point, Steve. Thank you for that response. That's good. We had another question come in. Connecting with the public has changed so much. Besides social platforms, how do we connect with our communities? That gets to kind of what you were just saying, Steve.
Yeah, I might let Glenn take this one in the community space.
Sure.
Social media.
Sure. Yeah. It's so the question was around creative ways to build trust. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. How do we connect with people besides social media platforms? How do we connect with communities, given that communities have changed so much in how people receive information?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, similar to the example I kind of walked through of that neighborhood, the mothers in the gyms, right? It's about observing what's going on in the communities, right? So that's difficult to do from afar. In that particular example, we had boots on the ground in that community, trying to understand what was going on. In that particular example, social media probably wasn't going to do the trick, because when you get down to the neighborhood level, that wasn't the right messenger. That wasn't how you're going to be able to connect with the community, right? So I think it comes down to just understanding your audience, just like anything else, and understanding the right messenger and right solution. And what works in that particular community is likely not going to work in another community if their motivators are different, right? Remember what I talked about in terms of trust, predisposition for change, and risk tolerance. That may look different in different neighborhoods. So it really requires an understanding of all of those elements before you can really start to make that connection and build the trust.
One really quick final question that came in. Have you found financial considerations or emotional considerations to be more effective?
Emotion 100% of the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I shouldn't say 100%, but almost. You can have all the logic in the world, but if somebody's got, an experience or something that they went through, numbers often don't matter. You got to connect to the emotional side of things.
Yep. Great.
I was going to say the same thing.
Great. Glenn, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the presentation and responding to these questions. This has been really informative. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Yep.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
We're going to move now into our final third presentation for this session by Kristin Murphy. It's titled Using Data and Science to Influence Complex Decisions in a Complex World. Here's a bit about Kristin. Kristin Murphy is a senior strategy consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton and has spent over 16 years developing and implementing business solutions for federal programs and private industry within the mission spaces of resilience, environmental protection, and climate change adaptation. Kristin delivers integrated program and portfolio strategy, analytics, behavior change, and stakeholder engagement solutions that transform organizational performance and optimize mission-level outcomes. Kristin is also an industry award-winning expert in applied innovation and design thinking theory for workshops and collaborative engagements, recognized multiple times for her work with FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program. We're looking forward to your presentation, Kristin, and with that, let's jump on in.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristin Murphy, and I'm a strategy consultant at Booz Allen Hamilton. and I've been working with the NFIP for the better part of the last decade. And I'm here to present about social marketing, or using a mesh of publicly available data and behavioral science to influence complex decisions in our increasingly complex world. So I'm going to focus on 4 main topic areas today. First, the prism of perception, the various ways that people process and make decisions about the risks that they face. Second, ways to use available data to profile, segment, and prioritize your audiences. Third, how to design risk communications techniques that are targeted to your audiences and proven to influence action. And finally, a couple of case examples that demonstrate this approach in action. So anyone who has been in the risk communications game for a while knows that people who face even the most severe risks don't always do what we think that they should, or what we think is logical or rational. And if I can pile on to that, there's even more, an even more urgent imperative at this point in our culture to use an updated approach to communicating risk in your community or your state, the trust and information crisis. So it's just an amazing phenomenon where over the last 50 plus years, as the availability of information and the diversity of sources rose exponentially, so too did people's level of distrust of each other and the media and the government and even scientists. So when we distrust the information that's being provided to us, what do? The science is pretty clear on this. In studies about the confirmation bias or the anger activism model, when we do not trust a source or a piece of information, we often avoid it altogether and opt to find our own sources, usually ones that fit better with our own existing worldview. We often doubt any elements of the information that seem particularly urgent or extreme, saying to ourselves, it can't be that bad, they're just polarizing or being alarmists. Or we might even get angry at the messenger or the institution behind the messenger, especially if the content triggers any of our moral beliefs, like what is inherently right or wrong. And we, in this case, might even double down on the opposite point of view. And there's probably a few other permutations of these behaviors, but they all ultimately lead to a failure to act. So this cultural moment that we've arrived at sort of demands that risk managers like us update our approach to risk communications, to use more data, more social and behavioral science to influence people to protect themselves from the impacts of natural disasters. So the first step to using data and science to better communicate risk is to understand how risk-based decisions and actions are processed. So we see the risks that we face and our options for addressing that risk through a prism of perception. The prism is made up of all of our past experiences, beliefs, personal motivations, and our current situation or context, right? So the prism of perception can take the same risk and the same set of options and refract it into new and different perceptions. So it logically follows that communicating in one way about this risk doesn't make sense, right? In fact, any hope of influencing risk-based decisions really must begin with meeting each perception of the risk with a tailored technique. So let's take a closer look at the prism. We can break the prism down into what social and behavioral scientists sort of know as the dimensions that drive decision-making and behavior. So we look at 3 dimensions: capability, opportunity, and motivation. The theory here, and it's kind of a meta theory, is that no action can occur without sufficient capability, opportunity, and motivation to do it. Now, if that seems overly simple or logical to you, that's good. It's supposed to be approachable, but there's a lot going on there underneath the surface. So bottom line, at any given time, we need our audiences, 1, to have and believe that they have the physical and cognitive ability to perform the action that we're asking of them. So they know how to do it and they are ready to do it when the opportunity arises. Second, we need our audiences to have reasonable access to the action, meaning it needs to be affordable, it needs to be available to them, and it needs to be socially acceptable to do what we're asking of them so they can do it at any given time. And third, we need our audiences to feel the urgent desire or need to take the action, that they must do it because it's necessary to avoid pain and that it is the good and right thing to do. The kicker here is that we need them to feel compelled to choose the action we're asking them to perform over a competing action, which includes doing nothing. Now, again, I'm oversimplifying here, but what if we consider that every person has just 3 levels, high, medium, and low, of capability, opportunity, and motivation? So that equates to more than 50 unique combinations or profiles of how your audience might be perceiving the same risk and the same set of options that you're presenting to them. So it stands to reason that we might want to spend a little more time understanding those profiles and perhaps presenting their risk and options in a way that addresses the dimensions where they're low or have barriers, as we social marketers call it. So how do we find these different profiles? The data is actually, it's out there. For risk communications, we look at profiling data from 3 lenses, right? First, the risk attributes of the audience. Second, the indicators of their capability, opportunity, and motivation. And third, their history of action. So first, on the top, the risk attributes of the audience. This is what most of us, I think, are most comfortable doing, that we do all the time. We're looking here at data that will help us characterize the types and frequency of the hazards that the audience faces, as well as their exposure and the potential severity of the impacts, right? So a few great sources of that kind of data are listed here. They include things like FEMA's National Risk Index, which is this awesome new tool that gives you, this hazard by hazard score for risk and expected losses, as well as scores for social vulnerability and community resilience. And it's at the census tract level, and it's downloadable, which is awesome. Open FEMA is another source where you can get, disaster declaration histories by county. FEMA's community engagement prioritization tool is also another awesome repository of information down to the local land use jurisdiction level or NFIP community level. And it includes data like estimated population in a special flood hazard area, number of repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties, and a lot more. And then also there's First Street's new flood factor tool, which while it's not able to be downloaded, offers, interesting current and future flood risk attributes down to the address level. So staying across the top here, we also want to look at the audience's history of taking action. So here we're looking at data that helps us understand the penetration rate of the action that we're asking our audience to do, right? Or the penetration rate of similar types of actions. More about why this is important in the following slide, but a few great sources of past action data include, again, Open FEMA, where you can find things like mitigation grants history. You can also find mitigated property counts and policy counts by jurisdiction in the STEP tool, community engagement prioritization tool, as well as, in that same tool, you can also find things like whether or not the community has adopted a more stringent ordinance than the minimum standards. You can also look at policy counts and policy types on Pivot if you have improved access. While it's a bit more manual, you can see the types of mitigation actions a community has identified and even funded in mitigation plans and capital improvement plans. And finally, you can see, for instance, if a community has taken more sophisticated flood risk management actions by looking at whether or not they're in FEMA's community rating system. Okay, so finally, the PRISM, which is at the bottom. This is our capability, opportunity, and motivation indicators. So we use data here in an interesting way. This is where we mix and remix lots of different data to formulate a perspective on whether there could be barriers related to capability, opportunity, or motivation to take the action within our audiences. So for capability, we're looking at indicators, or what we call proxy indicators, of whether the audience, and when I say audience, I mean as granular as you can get, right? The person, the census block or tract. We want to know for capability if that audience might have barriers in their real or perceived ability to take the action that we're asking of them. So this data gets at whether they might have barriers to understanding the steps of the action, or even believing that they have the power or the skill to take the action, right? So proxy indicators for capability could be whether or when the community last received like a training workshop from FEMA or a compliance visit. You can find this in the STEP tool. Another proxy indicator might be the audience's level of education. If the action we're asking of them is very complicated or highly technical, education levels you would get from census. Another proxy for capability could be whether the audience has demonstrated the capability to take action before, right? So this gets up to the top where we've got some tracking of past risk reduction actions, but we might also look at whether or not they've taken similar actions in the past. So when we look at, for instance, flood insurance, we might look at an audience's past actions for purchasing another type of optional insurance, for instance. Finally, another proxy indicator for capability could be the level of awareness that a particular audience has about a flood-specific topic. And this is something that you can get from media monitoring, looking at the relative size of flood conversations, right, compared across your audiences or geographies. Media monitoring is not free, but it is a really useful tool, scalable pricing that really helps you get at some of the dominant online conversation themes, sentiments, and influencers, which is really important for risk communications. So moving on to opportunity indicators, we're looking for proxy indicators of whether the action is truly available to the audience. So here we're looking for indicators of whether the action is affordable, right? So we might look at median income, poverty levels, and even age, right? Seniors that are on a fixed income, all of that from census to give us a sense of if there may be affordability barriers in place. We might also look at access indicators from census, like language barriers or access to technology and internet. Or depending on the action, we might even take a look at the geography, right? Whether the audience is in a particularly rural or disconnected area. We might also look at social vulnerability indices for the opportunity indicators, right? Either from CDC or SOVI, and the National Risk Index actually has the SOVI indicators in it. These bring together a lot of different data points and give us a sense for how, available, affordable, and frankly, normal it might be to take a certain action. And speaking of normal, we also want to understand if the audience might perceive the action we're asking them to do as odd or uncool for their community or for their set of values, right? It's amazing how powerful peer judgment is. People do not want to do something if they think others will judge them unfavorably. So we might, again, look at media monitoring data to get a sense for the sentiment and the core values held by the community to see if the action we're asking them to do would be perceived as normal or abnormal. Finally, motivation indicators. So for motivation, we're looking at data that helps us understand if the audience perceives the threat that they face to be urgent or severe enough to trigger their reflex impulses to avoid pain or losses. We also want to see if the audience perceives the action we're asking them to take. We want to see if they perceive that action to be good or the right thing to do, right? This is all predicated on whether the audience actually trusts that the risk is real and relevant to them, and that they trust that the options we're presenting to them will be effective in addressing it. So admittedly, motivation is tougher to get a pulse on without talking directly to your audience, which I wholeheartedly recommend that you do. But some proxy indicators for motivation, particularly impulsive motivation, so our fear of loss, our instinctual fear of loss, it might be the recentness of a catastrophic disaster or the absence of a recent catastrophic disaster. That could be a proxy indicator. So you could get like their last disaster declaration date, right, from the SEP tool, for instance. Have you ever heard somebody say like, yeah, it floods here all the time, but we always get through it. It's just a part of life. It's never that bad. Like flood saturation is actually a real motivational barrier. Another proxy indicator for impulsive motivation, again, the sort of instinctual reaction could be the distance to a flooding source. So more plainly, like, can they see the water out their window? For more conscious motivation, right, our judgments about what's good and bad and right and wrong, and our trust of whether something is the smart or right thing to do, we might look at indicators from like political affiliation from census, or we might also, again, look at the media monitoring data to understand the core values and sentiments within the communities. So that's a lot of information. The thing to remember here is that you want a way to compile this information and data in a way that allows you to do two things. First, you want to bring this data together to understand the general profiles of the audiences that you serve at the most granular level that you can, and that could be granular geographical level or another segment. And you want to understand specifically where they have barriers to taking action or could have barriers to taking action. The second thing you want to be able to do with this data is you want to be able to compare and group or segment your audiences so you can prioritize and plan your risk communications efforts to get the biggest bang for your buck. So in a world where none of us have unlimited resources, prioritization is key, right? Social marketers prioritize audience segments in across two main criteria, right? First is how much of the audience group, again, maybe this is a neighborhood, maybe it's the families who own homes within a certain neighborhood, how much of the audience group has already taken the action we want them to take. This is also known as the action penetration rate, right? The second criteria that we look at when we're prioritizing audiences is how high the capability, opportunity, or motivation barriers are for that audience group to take action. So imagine now that you're plotting your audience segments on this graph here on the screen. The audiences that you want to focus most on are at the bottom. These are the ones that have mostly not taken action, okay? These audiences represent the most opportunity to make a quantifiable difference in the risk. Now, among these two, it will likely be easiest and less resource intensive to influence the decisions and actions of the groups with the least barriers to action. However, it may be more impactful, although also more resource intensive, to influence the decisions and actions of the groups with a lot of barriers to action. So the groups at the top with already high penetration rates should be lower on your list of priorities where you have very limited resources. However, if you have the time and the money, groups that have low barriers to action are always a no-brainer. All right, so you've profiled, grouped, and prioritized your audiences. You have a better sense of where you can have the biggest impact and what barriers you need to overcome when you reach these audiences and ask them to do something about their risk. But what should you do, right? What's the best way to overcome the barriers that might exist within your audiences? Well, first, most importantly, you have to make choices. And this might be the hardest part. You have to make choices about what to highlight and emphasize to different audience groups and segments. To be clear, this doesn't mean taking away any options or taking away information, but to influence decisions and actions, we risk communicators must shine a brighter light on the things that compel our audiences to act, okay? So here on this slide, I have a handy cheat sheet for the types of techniques that social marketers consider when they find barriers, okay? These techniques have been proven in academic studies and social marketing programs for over 4 decades. So I'll offer some lesser known or lesser used examples from this list. First, persuasion techniques, which make use of visceral and personalized messages, imagery, and experiences, can help address capability barriers and motivational barriers. So for example, for capability barriers, where an audience group perhaps doesn't believe that they have the skills or ability to perform an action, we might offer real-world scenarios and simulations of decisions and impacts, right? For instance, we use this kind of technique to train soldiers for certain types of high stakes situations. Another sort of lesser known or lesser used technique is modeling. So modeling techniques offer examples of decisions and behaviors performed by peers or influencers. And it can be effective for many different types of barriers. For instance, for capability barriers, we might provide examples for the audience to imitate whenever they're unsure. For opportunity barriers, we might provide examples of peers performing the action we want the audience to take, so they are assured that it is normal and acceptable to do it. So last example I'll highlight here is redesign. So redesign techniques reframe or transform the decision environment. It makes processing the decision easier, more convenient, and faster. And it's awesome for opportunity barriers, or frankly, to address sort of all of our human tendencies to prefer the status quo or laziness. So for instance, we might simplify options or provide a good, better, best idea for our audience. So it's very easy to get to a yes. It's almost like an easy button. Anybody ever notice how tipping has changed in the last year? So when I go to place my order for grocery delivery, my app very conveniently presents me like an easy button for tipping 10, 15, or 20%. And I don't have to calculate anything. I just have to choose the one that I like, right? And how many of us probably tip more because of the options that are presented to us in those kinds of apps? Okay, so finally, this slide is a bit more about the art in risk communications and less so about the data and science, but important to bring up. I also want to touch on how to get these techniques that I've just talked about to your audiences in a way that's most likely to cut through the noise of daily life and facilitate, processing and decision-making that leads to action. So we want to consider 3 elements in our risk communications. 1, the creative packaging. 2, the channels that you push it through, and 3, the timing of your communications. So in our packaging, which is the words and the images and the experiences that we wrap our techniques in, we need to include an emotional hook, something that we tie to what the audience cares about most. We need to include the benefits exchange. So this is more than the return on investment. This must clearly present how the benefits of taking the action we're asking them to do almost immediately outweigh the benefits of doing something else, like waiting or doing nothing at all. Also in our packaging, we need to be specific about the call to action, and we need to make sure it is relevant to them. So the more specific we get with a call to action, the more likely it is to happen. When we're broad about what we ask our audiences to do, it gives them too much room to interpret the ask. And the more room they have to interpret, it actually means the more mental energy that they're spending on processing versus doing, right? So specificity is key. Okay, second area that we want to focus on is our channels, and that is the physical, social, or online places where we reach our audiences. So those places must be, first, the sources that they go to very frequently, 2, the sources that they most trust, and 3, it needs to be more than one. That's it. You got to hit them in more than one place, more than one time. And honestly, this is where a modest investment in media monitoring would really help, because it does help you understand what channels, what influencers your audience is going to most. So finally, timing. This is when we reach our audiences. So when we reach them can be just as important as why, right? We need to grab their attention in a context that makes sense to them at a time when it feels right to attend to the risk information that we're giving them. So first, consider convenience, right? When they're already, for example, when they're already searching for information, like during a flood map update, or when they visited your website, make action super convenient. Second, consider salience in your timing. So when they might more easily notice the risk information, like when they're looking at real estate, or when they're engaged in tangential topics like preventative healthcare or financial planning is a big one. Finally, consider relevance in your timing. So when risk information is directly related to what's in front of them, for instance, like when they're looking at the weather, or when they're driving down by the river, or every year before hurricane season, or at the anniversary of a major flood event, for instance. So I'm going to round out the presentation by illustrating what this could look like. So how you take profiles from data to communications product. So here's an example, and all of these are examples. Here's an example piece for a coastal city. So some of the data about the coastal city, the risk attributes of the coastal city, there's lots of exposure, as you might expect, lots of frequent, but not necessarily catastrophic flooding. Their past behaviors, they've got a relatively high flood insurance penetration rate within the special flood hazard area, but not necessarily outside in the routinely impacted areas, which is our target. So in terms of the PRISM, there are major motivational barriers at play here in this coastal city. So this coastal area, based on media monitoring information and what we're seeing in terms of the disaster history, they're saturated on flood. Flood is in all of the conversations and messages and daily life. Flooding is on the weather and local news all the time in this community. It's gotten to the point where nothing cuts through. They can't hear the flood messaging anymore. This is the community that says flooding is just a part of life. It is what it is. I deal with it all the time. what's the motivation to take action. So the technique that we want to use here is persuasion. And we want to use visceral, emotional messages and imagery to cut through the noise about flooding in this community. So our emotional hook here is actually pets. Because what happens if you have to leave your home in the event of a bad flood? What do you do with your pet? People really get concerned about what happens to their pets in a time when they're displaced. And the call to action here, or the immediate benefit, is that flood insurance can ensure that you get back into your home, into your pet's home, faster. And these, in terms of the placement, right? Timing, packaging, placement, this is placed in, this would be placed in nuisance flooding areas, right? The places around the community that always flood. So it's easy to look at that ad in the context of that area that floods, that you avoid every time it floods, on a monthly basis. So that's one example. A second example that we might use here is an example strategy for like a mixed suburban urban riverfront neighborhood that's also a historic district. And these are based on real places. So the risk attributes of this place is that it has lots of repetitive loss, a lot of repetitive loss, lots of frequent catastrophic flooding. It's right on a river. And like, for example, this favorite local restaurant that's pictured here has actually been flooded and frankly destroyed several times in just the last decade. So this community this neighborhood in terms of past behaviors, they've got a relatively good insurance penetration rate, but they've got very, very low mitigation given concerns about historic preservation. The hypothesis here is that the local officials actually need more public support and demand to undertake broader mitigation projects. So our target in this case may actually be the neighborhood residents first. So in terms of the prism, the barriers kind of exist across the board here, but primarily in terms of capability barriers, we're looking at the complexity of navigating historic preservation rules alongside of implementing mitigation measures. There's also sort of separately a lot of young renters in this area who lack awareness that they, in fact, have a role in protecting themselves and in protecting the neighborhood. On the motivation front, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. On the plus side, the population in this neighborhood skews very young. There's way more millennials than average in this neighborhood. It skews much more liberal, and it's a bit more affluent than the surrounding neighborhoods. And the core values here among these residents are those of sort of a safer, more resilient, and more equitable world. So that's on the plus side of motivation. On the not so positive side, there's a strong motivation to retain the historic character of the neighborhood. And there's this sentiment that historic preservation and mitigation are actually kind of diametrically opposed. So our technique here is persuasion and modeling. So on the persuasion front, we want to grab attention with removable high water mark building decals in the very high risk downtown active area, along with a very easy to remember website. So we spark attention, we grab people's attention among the noise, right? Then the website has information that promotes that history and resilience in this neighborhood are actually intertwined. We can't maintain the character of the neighborhood if it's washed away, right? It also includes examples, so modeling of at-risk residential and commercial buildings and other areas in the neighborhood that have implemented mitigation measures before, right? And successfully maintain the historic character of those buildings. And then it has illustrated steps for how to do it, right? Really easy illustrated steps, so modeling and education. And then finally, the site has very specific information for like contents only flood insurance coverage for renters. So this concludes my presentation. I hope this has been a helpful resource for using publicly available data and behavioral science to better influence your audiences to make more risk-informed decisions. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that presentation as much as I did. I'm joined here with Kristin Murphy herself. Thank you so much for joining our Q&A period. I know we are running out of time, but we are really excited to chat with Kristin for a minute to answer some of your questions that have come in. So do stick around with us for a couple more minutes. Kristin, we got two questions that are kind of related. I wanted to throw out there to you and you could respond back. So they are, how do you get an accurate picture of a community by drawing from a few data sources without accidentally cherry picking an unrepresentative picture of the community. And then related to that, someone asked, so is most of the information necessary to make these assessments in the publicly available data, or is some amount of targeted surveying necessary?
Yeah, so I appreciate those conversations, and those questions, and I think that they're coming from sort of one place, which is, should we talk directly to our audience? And the answer is yes, absolutely, right? So what bringing together this data does, and what profiling does, is it helps you get an initial picture. What I like to say is it helps us understand where to dive deeper. It helps us understand the types of questions that we might want to ask directly with the audience, whether that's a community or a neighborhood or an individual. It helps us better understand what we're facing. It helps us make big prioritization decisions, right? But at the end of the day, when you go out there and you create behavior change interventions and communications techniques for your audiences, you shouldn't do it without really feeling like you know who they are. And that really, in a lot of ways, comes primarily from talking to them. But there's a way to be able to make that surveying effort or make that focus group effort really targeted and efficient by first doing your profiling and scanning, right? So I think that's the answer is don't assume that all the publicly available data has given you the precise picture. It's given you what you need to know where to dive deeper.
Thank you for that. And the final question I'll ask is, someone raised, where can one access a CEP tool and what information is in this tool?
Yeah, so go to FEMA.gov. I really hope Quentin Cummings is on the webinar right now and could just write this in. But if you go to FEMA.gov and search Community Engagement Prioritization Tool, you should be taken to a link, and it will take you to the explanation of that tool and off to the Geo platform where you can look at it. And there's I can't even begin to list all the awesome stuff that's in there. It's from the floodplain management program, so they're looking at all kinds of things, from compliance to, like I said earlier, the last training that happened in that community. They're looking at all kinds of risk attributes, including, policy counts and things like that. That tool also brings in the social vulnerability index from CDC. So it gives this really interesting picture of sort of who the most vulnerable communities are, what their disaster histories are, and it's all meant to try to help figure out, when and how to engage those communities. So it's awesome, and it's on FEMA.gov. Great.
Thank you so much, Kristin. We got some positive response and feedback in the chat as well. They really appreciated your presentation. So thanks so much for your time and joining us today. That will wrap up our session around behavioral science and risk communications. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and enjoy the rest of the conference.